Hi, I'm Carys.
And I'm Daniel Trilling.
We're on a mission to make sense of the news and understand why the media obsesses over some stories, completely ignores others, and whether Peter Mandelson's actually kind of basic. This is Over the Top, Under the Radar. My co-host this week is Daniel Trilling. Daniel is a journalist and author based in London. He focuses on human rights and politics, particularly right-wing nationalism and migration. And he's been shortlisted for the Orwell Prize, among other things. He's also got a brilliant new book out, If We Tolerate This. You can see the cover if you are watching the episode. How the British establishment made the far right respectable, available now in all good bookstores. Hi, Daniel. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Carys.
So when did the book come out? Are you deep in book promo mode?
Yeah, it came out at the very end of April. So I've been talking about it a lot. We tried to get the book out quite quickly so that it would feel very current. And our first thought was the May local elections, but actually there's been loads of stuff happening since that.
I was going to say, it feels super relevant. You're up to 2025 and a lot of the stuff that you're talking about, you really kind of go up to present day.
Even a bit of 2026, actually.
Yeah, a little bit. You're right. It's what was the idea behind it? What was the impetus? I know, you've written a lot about the far right, reform and other parties. What made you feel like you wanted to do this book now?
Well, so I've been writing about this subject since around 2009. So it's something I've followed long term. And, that's a period over which it's gone from being this very marginal, if alarming, current within British politics and politics more broadly around the world, but kind of being the major or one of the major political currents of our time. I've reported on that over the years and tracked that, but it just felt that last year things rapidly got a lot worse in British political culture. There was this kind of really rapid shift even further to the right than things had got previously, with mainstream politicians saying things that at the beginning of my career I would have expected to hear from the BNP, the British National Party, and few others. And so what I tried to do with the book was bring that all together in a way that would be very useful for readers who just want to have it explained how we got here, why that is, what we can do about it.
And it's lots of things, but it's a really good primer, and you actually begin with kind of the 2010 BNP manifesto at the start of the book, and it is shocking how much of it is now in mainstream politics. I really loved it. It's a really easy read for people who kind of want to pick it up and understand, but lots of things struck me about it and lots of it relevant to the news agenda this week. But one of the things that I thought you bring out really well, and I hadn't kind of reflected on until I read your book, is just how much of what we're dealing with now is a result of that coalition and then Cameron-led government, the net migration targets, obviously the Brexit referendum, the way that things were put in motion in the 2010s, and you go back further to the 80s, that we're now having to deal with and now kind of exacerbating all the things that make people want to vote for far-right parties.
Yeah, for me it was really important to get all of that in there, because if you don't explain the wider context, you're left with the far right's explanation for everything, which is, in the UK, immigration.
Yeah.
That idea that there's just a very simple relationship between immigration and then people voting for right-wing populists, and actually it's down to all of these other things as well.
Yeah, well, I think that brings us on to the meat of the show. Daniel and I have taken a look at the news agenda, and we've each picked one story we think the media has gone over the top on, and one that we think has flown under the radar and not been talked about enough. I'm going to kick us off. My over the top for this week is two-tier policing. So we're recording this show on a Wednesday. The trial of the killer of Henry Novak has just taken place. He's been given a life sentence. Henry Novak was an 18-year-old boy in Southampton at uni, going home at night, a little bit drunk, but not over the legal limit to drive. He encounters two brothers. We have footage from Henry's phone and we have the footage from the police camera. There's a gap between those two things. But what we do know is he's talking to a man and his brother. He gets stabbed repeatedly. And when the police arrive at the scene, he tells the officers, in what is very heartbreaking to watch when you know what happens to Henry, he says to the officers, I've been stabbed, I can't breathe. The police basically ignore him, don't see the stab wounds. He bleeds out and dies. So that is the case. It's really horrible. I don't think that it has been over-reported, but the thing that happened next after the trial, after the conviction, was that within a few hours, Nigel Farage, who, you have a few words for Farage and different far-right people, grifters, I think was that Tommy Robinson?
Yeah, well, Farage kind of taps into the grifter.
All the things.
As
yeah,
well.
like arch political grifter, but also just like really effective operator. Nigel Farage, he did an emergency press conference on Tuesday morning. He's put out a number of TikTok videos about this, and he's jumped on Henry Novak's killing very quickly and very ruthlessly and said it is an example of two-tier policing. He has said that the police care more about being called racist than a white boy's life. He drew parallels with the George Floyd killing, which don't fully curl over. I'm sure we're going to get into it, and condemned Keir Starmer for taking the knee. And he said in like what was quite a chilling and like very well-written remark, he said that Henry Novak's family have been very sort of graceful and dignified, but it was our job, I assume he means white people's job, not my job, to respond with cold fury. We're recording this on a Wednesday. There have been protests in Southampton with angry white people taking the knee. I mean, it's a terrible story to have to talk about, but it's a perfect week to have you on the show. I guess the thing that struck me about how the media is covering this is that Farage and the far right are, as they did with Southgate, as they did with lots of things, like manipulating a moment for their ends. And the establishment, the left, like there seems to be kind of a resounding silence other than to say, this is divisive, this isn't nice, this is mean, you're politicising it. But I guess what struck me is that there's no alternative story being told, and so then Farage's is the one that keeps hold. But I'd be interested in what you think of the coverage and the story.
Yeah, well, I think, this is like the third summer we're going into where there have been these outpourings of kind of anger and racism or similar things that have been stirred up by political entrepreneurs, social media activists and so on. And I think something that's characterised the media and mainstream political responses has been, it's been almost like they're spectators to what's going on. Oh, this is happening, and sort of, it's bad, we disapprove of, bad behaviour, but like no real effort to call this thing what it is, which is trying to whip up mobs, trying to encourage ethnic conflict, basically, and racism and so on.
I mean, Nigel Farage said white lives matter in his speech. I am not familiar enough with the inciting racial hatred laws, but like he pretty clearly makes it about race and encourages that white people should be angry, right?
Yeah, and I think Tommy Robinson has done similar. So he was present at one of the protests in Southampton this week. And I mean, people are kind of sticking their oar in different ways. But as we saw last summer with the Asylum Hotel protests and the summer before with the riots after the Southport murders, basically people are tacitly or not encouraging kind of mob violence on the streets. And I think that's been given a free pass in ways that I find quite alarming, actually, by the mainstream.
I mean, it feels like we're just like inexorably and inevitably moving further and further and further right. I think the other thing that I guess I wanted to talk to you about, because he's so effective and the far right are so effective at like connecting with people's emotions, and you talk about that a lot in the book. I was thinking a lot about why Farage's intervention was so effective and so sort of chilling. And it's that you can't read about this case and you can't watch the body cam footage without having like a strong, visceral and emotional reaction. And for some people that will be horror, for some that will be anger. And what Farage and co do is they tap into that fear and they tell you who you should be angry at, and they kind of harness that emotion. And I think then on the other hand, you have mainstream Labour politicians who will condemn the violence, or, Keir Starmer said watching the video it made him feel sick. I find it fascinating how low agency Keir Starmer is when he talks about things. But it's like that we need a response that connects with that emotional gut punch of seeing an 18-year-old boy bleed out. I watch that and I think about, he's 18 at Southampton, he's a student, they assume he's drunk. If he read as not working class, would he have been treated differently? If they didn't think he'd had a drink, would he have been treated differently? But the thing I come back to is like, as well as his killer going to prison, like rightly, and the people that covered up the crime, like the next conversation surely has to be about those police officers and what they did and why. And we don't get to have that conversation because Farage just told us what it's about, and it's not about the police. You talked a lot about the way that the far right connects with emotion. I mean, for me, that feels like the biggest gap and the biggest void, and the reason that Farage gets to sort of run away with this stuff.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think mainstream politicians, because they've been caught on the hop really by these big, the fragmentation of British politics, but also the ways that our forms of communication have changed radically, they're just not able to kind of emote and use emotion and connect that to kind of rational argument and political argument in the way that politics always needs to effectively anymore. They're kind of stuck, particularly a politician like Starmer, like you say, low agency. And this is exactly what I mean. Like, it sounds like a spectator. You know, I was appalled when I saw this. Okay, great. You're not the head teacher, you know, like, and it shouldn't be that difficult to occupy the space that Farage is doing at this precise moment, which is essentially to say that, you know, this is absolutely appalling crime. The police made a huge error, partly because the perpetrator made a false accusation of racist violence. There's a massive question there about, well, what were the police doing in that situation? What were their procedures? Were they following what they were supposed to be doing? Were they not following what they were supposed to be doing? Who sets those rules? All of that. But before you get onto that, you have to just very clearly say, this is appalling. Policing is the kind of job where mistakes and abuses of power have life or death consequences for people. That happens far too often in our society. There's a big list of those mistakes leading to deaths and other forms of misery for people, very often working class people, that we can go back just a few years and start reeling off, you know, the murder of Sarah Everard, revelations that the police had been harbouring rapists in their midst, the strip searching of the black teenage girl in London a few years ago. You know, this stuff happens. It's really appalling. We need to talk about how to stop it. But if you make it about race, all you are doing there is encouraging racism and encouraging people to turn to violence as a solution, which is just absolutely wrong. So I don't know, how long did that take me? 30 seconds. That's what a politician with the platform and power that someone like Keir Starmer or Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary, could be doing now. And I just think it's so revealing and so alarming that they're not.
Yeah, and weirdly, the person who's come closest so far is Kemi Badenoch, who talked, I would say, fairly powerfully about her son, who is mixed race, and how, you know, she felt scared for him watching the footage. And yeah, she tried to do that. She tried to say Farage is making it about race and it shouldn't be about race, which, yeah, weird that I would be referring to her. I mean, I think you've hit on a really important thing with the police, though, because I do think it really isn't enough when Nigel Farage stands up or Tommy Robinson stands up to say, aren't they divisive? Aren't they awful? And we do need to have a conversation about policing in this country because, rightly, Henry Novak's killer has gone to prison. And what's going to happen to the officers who let a boy bleed out on the floor? Like, statistically, probably nothing. And like, I wanted to talk about this a little bit because at the moment in the UK, and you talked about Sarah Everard, we could come up with so many other cases running back decades. Last year, there were 94,940 complaints about the police to the IOPC. That translated into 15 convictions of police officers. So that is a 0.016% rate. So 0.01, less than a percent, much less than a percent of police that get a complaint made about them have a conviction or have consequences. And that is partly because the IOPC is the police policing itself. Like, we don't have accountability mechanisms for police in the UK that work well. Like, if you compare it to something like doctors and you look at complaints to the General Medical Council, which is an independent body, doctors do not police themselves, then that conviction rate goes up. 67 doctors were struck off in that same period. The other bit of the conversation that we need to have is, it's awful that this happened to Henry Novak, and it's appalling that those police officers ignored him. We don't actually know why they did what they did. There should be a process to find that out. But the thing that we statistically do know is, like, it's very unlikely that anything will happen to those officers.
Okay, so my over the top is the Peter Mandelson WhatsApps.
The WhatsApps, yes.
Yeah.
We've had another batch of Mandelson WhatsApps, partly redacted because of the humble address. Talk to us about them.
What so this is the latest huge batch of information that's been released because the government have been forced to release it by MPs relating to Peter Mandelson's appointment as ambassador to the US. Was he vetted? Wasn't he vetted? Whatever the case, the fact that he was good friends with Jeffrey Epstein, the world's most famous serial paedophile and sex trafficker, turned out to be a big reputational issue. And you know,
not the only one. He also had a lot of business connections with Russia and China. Really was quite a laundry list of reasons he shouldn't have had the job.
Exactly. Many reasons going back many years across his political career. But the government have been forced to release lots of information that they have about Mandelson and the work he was doing for the Starmer government. The latest batch are mainly, as I understand it, private communications between MPs and people in the government, so WhatsApps for the most part. And it's an important story. You know, we're saying it's overcovered. Perhaps it's covered in the wrong way. And I think what struck me with it is the way that the kind of juicy political revelations are actually quite banal. Like the fact that Mandelson didn't think much of Keir Starmer as Prime Minister, him and like 90% of the British population. He thinks Starmer hasn't got a plan for government, is something that came up in these messages. Many other MPs also think that. They're asking Mandelson for advice. And Mandelson's sage advice was Starmer needs to focus on delivery. Great. He's supposed to be this political genius. And
that's
like,
pretty weak.
Do good
source.
things that people like. Don't do nothing, or bad things that people don't like.
Be good at your job.
Yeah.
You're doing bad. Do better. Yeah.
And so for me, what it kind of really adds to something we are aware of already, but this fleshes it out, which is like what you're seeing is what has happened to the Labour Party when it runs on autopilot. Starmer became Labour leader as the head of a faction whose main purpose in life was to crush the left and make sure the left could get nowhere near power within the Labour Party ever again. Beyond that, there wasn't really much to them. So what they landed at was this kind of sort of knee-jerk, reflexive tendencies picked from various different historical Labour traditions. So it's kind of zombie Blairism, that's been a big part of the government in certain circumstances, but also an older kind of, I suppose, what used to be described as the Labour right, that there's a bit statist but nothing radical, quite hardline on social issues where you think the conservative bits of your base are going to be upset if you don't, publish videos showing how many immigrants you've deported and so on and so on. And just not much of a plan beyond that. And I think that's the thing that's really come out of these WhatsApps. But that's not really the bit that's been focused on from what I've seen. You're
right. I mean, the coverage, it's always, it's peak media feeding frenzy territory, right? It's like thousands, like all these pages for us to pour over and pull things out of. You're right, none of it's particularly surprising at this point. A lot of government ministers brief off the record to journalists most of this stuff. So we kind of know no one rates Keir Starmer. And as you say, we have been told that Mandelson is this brilliant political mind, this phenomenal operator. And effectively, the government hasn't communicated well about this, but effectively what they've been saying is, look, Peter Mandelson's a genius. He had to be the US ambassador. Like, he has, even now, people who defend Keir Starmer's decision will be like, this man, this mind, it was only him that could have taken on Trump. And then in the WhatsApps, it's like Peter Mandelson's getting angry because we haven't made a special red box for Donald Trump because there was some idea that making him a fake red ministerial box would be good. And it's taking a while for the box to be made and Peter Mandelson loses shit. And it's like, is this really... Like, is Peter Mandelson actually kind of basic? I guess that was my takeaway from this. Like, is he all that?
Well, I think what came out of it for me, these latest WhatsApps and correspondence that has already been made public, is, I mean, maybe at one point he was some kind of strategic genius, but he definitely doesn't seem like one now. What he seems very good at is making people feel clever and important and good about themselves. It kind of shows you, obviously it was a politically stupid decision to appoint him as ambassador in the first place because it wasn't like anything needed to be revealed about Epstein and his relationships with people like Mandelson and so on. We all knew it already, and I think it should have been obvious that at some point that was going to erupt again and cause problems. But also, the Starmer government can't say the basic thing to explain why they did it, which was clearly when they realised that Donald Trump was going to be the next US president, and that messed up their plans. They probably think, well, the usual reputational considerations don't matter. Mandelson is good at making people like Donald Trump feel good, and Donald Trump, as we know, is kind of incredibly emotional and egotistical, and he will base massive political decisions on whether he feels like somebody has been obsequious enough to him or not. You remember when he had the go at Zelensky, the Ukrainian prime minister, when he visited the US for not wearing a suit. So their calculation was probably, we know Mandelson's completely inappropriate for the job, but we think in these changed political circumstances, it's worth the risk.
Huge thank you to Joshua, who joined us on Patreon this week. Welcome. If you like the show and you want to support what we do, go to patreon.com/overthetop under the radar. Patrons get a bonus episode of the show each week, so you'll get a further conversation with me and Daniel. You get to submit questions to hear from our guests, and you get access to the over-under WhatsApp community where the conversation is lively and continues between shows. Right now, about 350 people donate to the show on Patreon, and that is how we can make it, cover our basic production costs, and that means you get to listen to it ad-free. That isn't enough to cover all of our costs. We need more Patreon supporters so that everyone on the show gets a fair wage and that we can keep making Over the Top Under the Radar. If you like what you hear and you want to support the show, please go to patreon.com/Over the Top Under the Radar. It makes a huge difference.
Okay, so my Under the Radar is a story about the Troubles Legacy Act. So if that's not a familiar
I think we're going to have to explain that
piece
one.
of legislation to you, I will
flew
explain.
under my radar before you told me about it. So what's the Troubles Legacy Act?
So this is a piece of legislation that was brought in by the Boris Johnson government. It was introduced in 2020, 2021 and became law under Rishi Sunak a few years later. Long story short, the Good Friday Agreement, the peace agreement at the end of the 90s, didn't make much, if any, provision for truth and reconciliation and how historic crimes committed during the Troubles would be dealt with. You know, would people just be prosecuted for them under the regular criminal law? Would there be some kind of commission where there would be sanctions and punishment, or would it be something like the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission where you would get immunity for giving full and frank testimony about your role in crimes and so on?
And for people who aren't familiar, there were a huge number of people that were murdered or disappeared before the Good Friday Agreement, a huge amount of violence committed by paramilitary groups, the police, the army. So there are a lot of people who lost loved ones and they don't know why or how. Yeah,
this was a 30-year conflict with several different parties to the conflict, all of whom committed human rights abuses. Over 3,500 people were killed during the Troubles, but others were kidnapped, tortured, abused. Republican and loyalist paramilitaries engaged in violence against civilians, but so did the British state. There were also questions around what the Irish state's role in the conflict was. You know, what did the Irish government and its own security services know about Republican paramilitaries preparing their attacks in the Republic of Ireland and crossing the border and so on. So
there's a huge amount, there are a huge number of cases, and the Legacy Act was an attempt to address that. But how did it propose addressing it?
Well, it said it was an attempt to address that. What it really was an attempt to sweep all of that under the carpet. So in the 2010s, the different communities and political parties in Northern Ireland had just about negotiated a way forwards that there would be a kind of historical truth commission set up to investigate crimes, but there would still be criminal sanctions for people responsible, because that's something that victims groups really wanted and other people with a say really wanted. Almost as soon as that was agreed, there was this huge right-wing backlash in England, in the national UK media, against the prosecution of British veterans for historic crimes. You know, that was a big thing going up to the end of the 2010s. The spectacle of now elderly men who had served in Northern Ireland in the 70s or 80s being put on trial. Only happened to a handful of people, but that was a big campaigning cause for the right. The Boris Johnson government came in and said, we will sort this out for you. We'll come up with a solution that's fair for everyone and we'll stop veterans getting prosecuted. And what they initially proposed was just a blanket amnesty for all crimes committed during the Troubles. That really upset people across...
So anyone that committed any crime during the Troubles, it's fine, it's cool.
So not just veterans, but, for example, former IRA members would have been covered by this. There was a big backlash against that from lots of different groups for different reasons, depending on where people stood in relation to the conflict. The Johnson government softened that, and in the end, the Troubles Legacy Act, it halted criminal investigations and stopped people being able to take civil action over crimes during the Troubles, because that was also something that was happening quite a lot by the end of the 2010s, and gave all of the work of investigating these historic crimes and incidents to a new commission that would offer immunity from prosecution to anybody who helped with their investigations. And that was really criticised, in both unionist and nationalist communities in Northern Ireland for being far too soft, that you wouldn't really have to cooperate that much in order to get that immunity, whereas by comparison, and the government compared it to South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission post-apartheid.
Which is a bit of a gold standard, isn't it? Of how you try to heal a society.
But that had a very high threshold for cooperation. You had to be really forthcoming with the details on what you did, what you knew about what other people did, and your contribution was assessed by a judge. The judge had to say, yes, I think you've been full and frank here and I'll grant you the immunity. In the British case, with the Troubles Legacy Act, it was much more discretionary. So this was really heavily criticised. I did a big bit of reporting on the Troubles Legacy Act just after it became law.
We'll link to it in the show notes. It's a really good piece for the LRB.
Yeah, that was for the LRB. And to give a sense of the range of people that this act affected and who was opposed, I spoke to the family of Magella O'Hare, who was a young girl who was shot dead by a British paratrooper in the 1970s, completely unprovoked, shot dead on a quiet country road, shot in the back. She was very young. And her family, particularly her brother Michael, who I met and interviewed, have campaigned for justice ever since. The soldier responsible was acquitted by a judge-only court quite close to the incident in an investigation that was woefully insufficient. Years later, the family got an apology from the Ministry of Defence, but there's still been no actual accountability beyond that. And then the other family that I spoke to were the family of a British soldier, Private Tony Harrison, who was shot dead by an IRA hit squad in the early 1990s. And it then later emerged that a member of that hit squad had been an informant to the British security services. And there's a big question over, did the British security services, the police, spy agencies, the army, whoever might have been involved in that, know that this murder was planned and was going to take place?
And that's kind of what's brought this into the news this week, right?
So the newest bit of this story is that Labour said they would repeal the Legacy Act, but the kind of new process that they're going to replace it with is still up in the air. Meanwhile, a piece of investigative journalism by a very good Belfast media outlet called The Detail, who then collaborated with The Guardian on it, found that the security services, so MI5, police, army, whoever, had been involved in the committee that shaped and drafted the Troubles Legacy Act. So this is a part of the state that is directly implicated in many of the crimes involved, and yet they were being given a say in how the legislation about how they would potentially be held accountable for those crimes was drawn up and what was eventually passed. So I think this just kind of shows yet another layer of how the Troubles Legacy Act was really, beyond anything else, an effort at an establishment cover-up, an attempt to sweep all of this difficult history under the carpet.
I mean, it feels like it connects a lot to the sort of one of the earlier stories of just this, like, where is the accountability for the people who wield violence on behalf of the British state? And it feels like there isn't
precisely
any. It's a really good under the radar, and it's yeah, I mean, on one level, you sort of see why it doesn't get picked up by the media. I don't think we need to go deep into sort of MI5 conspiracy theories, but it requires a level of knowledge and explanation. But it is also, I guess, a little bit about the way our media is skewed towards London and the UK and the sort of erasure of Northern Irish history and a country that is it's post-conflict, right? It's a place where people were being killed and disappeared, and there were paramilitary groups, who aren't all kind of fully dissipated. I mean, it's a real kind of testament to investigative journalism. But I mean, what needs to happen next?
Well, I think obviously this is dealing with historic behaviour by the state, and primarily it's about accounting for that behaviour, and not just by the state, but by the paramilitary groups involved in the conflict. So I suppose this is a reminder that as Labour puts together whatever's going to replace the Troubles Legacy Act, that it has to actually deliver accountability. And I think the real political challenge here at the moment is that the government has to be very careful not to cave into pressure from the right, because this issue of veterans being prosecuted has reared its head again. So Reform have taken this up and are running with it. In January, when they announced that raft of Tory defectors, Suella Braverman, Robert Jenrick, one of the big press conferences they did around that time was actually the launch of Veterans for Reform, where Suella Braverman, newly minted Reform MP, gave a speech. I think that might have been where she attacked DEI, diversity policies and so on. But the big other theme of that conference and that kind of press push was that Reform was now going to protect veterans from what they call vexatious prosecutions. And given the government's fear when faced with this kind of pressure for the right, it's important to look very carefully at what they are putting together in terms of helping people find out the truth about what was done during the Troubles and get some kind of accountability and closure. And I think I would also say, as you mentioned, these stories about the relationship between Britain and Ireland often get overlooked in the national UK media. And I think that's a problem for two reasons. One is because they're just important stories. We're talking about severe injustices here and a failure to kind of reach some kind of resolution. But also, you cannot understand the country that we live in without understanding what has gone on between Britain and Ireland historically, but in our recent history most of all, because it shows you the nature of the state that we all contribute to and, elect politicians to run and so on.
My under the radar for this week is, again, reform related. It's Durham Pride. A few months ago, Darren Grimes, who is a reform councillor, he often compares reformed rallies. I don't know if you watch any reform rallies.
I was not aware of that.
Yeah, he's got a kind of Butlins presentational style. Know way too much about Darren Grimes. So Darren Grimes, reform politician, deputy leader of Durham Council, announced a few months ago on social media that Durham Pride wouldn't be getting a single penny from the council next year. Darren Grimes is gay. He identifies as gay, but he said that Pride had stopped being a celebration of gay rights a long time ago. The Reform Council said, we're not funding Pride. It was £2,500 that I think the council were meant to contribute. Maybe there was some top up from other funding. And they said, no, Pride is a travelling billboard for gender ideology, and that many in the gay community, including Darren Grimes, don't want any part of it. So Reform graciously said that Pride could still go ahead, but that basically there'd be no public money for it. And what happened next was quite beautiful and magical. And if people have seen the film Pride or are familiar with the miners' strike, the Durham trade union movement and the trade union movement more broadly stepped into the gap, and they fundraised for and funded Durham Pride, which took place on the weekend. And they raised £20,000, so 10 times what the council had cut in funding. And Claire from Steps was at Pride. Sounds like a great day. And basically, Reform stepped back, the community stepped in, and we got a really good example that has historical context to it of solidarity, of communities that aren't directly affected by something, although obviously there are gay miners and gay people in the trade union movement, but one group of people looking at another group of people and saying, we are in a similar struggle and we're going to help each other out. And it got, I think, picked up by The Guardian, maybe a couple of other outlets. I think it's interesting. I think it's a really beautiful story. I think it's an example of the kind of community organising that we're going to need as reform are on the rise. And I also think we need to hear in a week where we're going to have a lot of divisive protests and a lot of people telling us who not to trust and who not to support and who we're in competition with. I thought it was a really good example of the alternative version, which is that actually we're in community with people and we should be supporting one another. I'm assuming this didn't fly under your radar, given you're a professional reform watcher.
Exactly, yeah. I did spot this. But actually I didn't read into it in that much detail. And reading into it, I think, was actually very, very worth it because, one question that comes up a lot at the moment for obvious reasons is what do we do about all of this? So as a journalist, I've spent a lot of time describing and explaining why things are bad, why the far right has got more successful. But now more than ever, there's a need to say, well, how do we push back? I just think that story of the way that people came together and, came together in a very friendly, sort of life-affirming, heartwarming way, but actually had some real political bite to it as well, that it was a brave thing to do, and it was also very effective because, to raise that amount of money and to put on the Pride Parade, I think they said it was their biggest one yet. It wasn't just that they kept it alive.
It was bigger than ever.
They pushed back and surpassed themselves. It's really important, I think, because of where it's happening. One of the things I write about in the book is the way that the kind of misrecognition of Britain that is propagated in the London-based media and in Westminster politics kind of makes reform's job easier and makes that kind of reactionary politics more successful than it needs to be, which is this idea that the country is completely sort of split between these two totally alien cultures, that you've got urban, multicultural, socially liberal London and the big cities, and then you've got the provinces, which sort of stereotypes in various ways, but the biggest stereotype of all is that idea of the red wall, that former industrial towns and communities around England particularly have been left behind by all the cultural change that's happened in other parts of the country, and all uniformly have these socially conservative and reactionary views. The grain of truth there in that is that those kind of communities, plus many, many others, have been abandoned by the centre of political power over a period of decades. You know, Britain has become a much more unequal place, not only economically, but geographically and regionally. But something that I know, partly from having lived in different bits of the country, partly from having done lots of reporting on these subjects for a long time, is that you cannot just simply write off a community as just it's all this thing or it's another. You know, even where Reform have done really well in terms of their vote in the recent local elections, for instance, there are many, many people in those communities who really oppose what they stand for. You know, why wouldn't Durham, for instance, be as much a site of political debate and contestation as Westminster is? And I mean, we know it is. We live in Britain. People who live here know this. But the way it's talked about and framed in the media often misses all of that. And so I think the ability of people not only to challenge something locally where they live, you know, they've really put the Reform Council there that cancelled the Pride event under pressure, but they've created something symbolic that inserts itself into a very, very narrow and withered media conversation as well. It's, you know, often it's the left that gets accused of identity politics and engaging in identity politics in a damaging way. I think this is identity politics par excellence. You know, what Reform are doing there is saying we're against Durham Pride and we're pro this, and you have to pick one or the other. You know, and there will be plenty of people in that community, as well as many others around the UK, that feel proud about living in England, want to celebrate the fact they're English, will fly the flag happily, and also will happily endorse a Pride march. And I think that's why challenging this stuff wherever we live is really important, because if you only rely on national politicians and the national media to do it, it kind of plays into the hands of this actually very divisive form of solidarity that Reform is trying to foster and build.
I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Daniel. Where can people find you and your work?
You can find me on Instagram or Blue Sky or in the London Review of Books and the Guardian Long Read for the most part.
Thank you, Daniel, for joining me, and thank you for listening. That's all we've got time for. If you want our bonus conversation, go to patreon.com/overthetop under the radar and support the show today.